Our next speaker is Paul Webb. He's a project officer with Southern Queensland Landscapes. He's been involved with NRM for 16 years and with Southern Queensland Landscapes and its predecessor organisations. Prior to that, he spent 20 years measuring stream flow and water quality in rivers all across Queensland. And in 2016, he was given the opportunity to undertake a research project to ascertain if NRM management was leading to improved grazing land management and what changes in management have meant for stream sediment loads. It's not all doom and gloom, so please don't take off with that intro. That management has improved. We can still do a lot more, but the trend in management is still in the right direction. NRM and other initiatives are making a difference. There's current available remote sensing and modelling can and is informing investment. So to talk a bit more about that, please welcome to the stage Paul Webb.
Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you some work that we've done on quantifying the outcomes of NRM investment in improved grazing land management. This is the work that I've done with support from Jeff Cockfield, Armando Apan, and David Waters, who supervised the work. I'll talk to you about what we're doing going towards improved grazing land management. First of all, we'll look at regional natural resource management investment, then the management signal in ground cover, so a qualitative intermediate outcome measure for investment, and then the implications for soil loss and stream sediment loads, which moves into quantitative assessment. I'll then look briefly at enablers and barriers for ongoing investment. There's a lot of people to acknowledge, in particular the graziers who currently manage our country, the regional NRM bodies, the Queensland Murray-Darling Committee and Southern Queensland Landscapes, Queensland Government Remote Sensing Group and the Source Modelling Team, also the University of Southern Queensland, in particular Charles Haywood, God rest his soul, who sponsored this work by bequeathing scholarship money, the Australian Government, who also supported this with fee relief, the co-authors I've mentioned, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we work in, the First Peoples of the Queensland Murray-Darling Basin and further abroad. Looking first at NRM investment in a global context. In the 70s and 80s, it became widely accepted that the null hypotheses, if you like, if we kept doing what we were doing, our future didn't look pretty. So we had to do a bit of work and put a bit of money into making our future look a bit more hopeful. Within Australia, the NRM investment was undertaken over many years in the 80s, 90s, 2000s and ongoing. We looked at community engagement capacity building first, then institutional capacity building, and from the early 2000s, regional delivery of targeted incentives. If we look at the green line showing in the graph here, we're looking at the annual investment in millions of dollars, and it peaked in 2004 at over $500 million a year. If you look at the gold underneath that, it's the cumulative investment from the early 1980s through to 2018, where $10 billion was invested by the Commonwealth and state governments together. I'm going to look in particular at the regional NRM investment period, but since we've got ground cover going back to 1990, we also have the opportunity to have a look at what I'll call the land care period from 1990 to 2004. A lot of this investment has been undertaken, and reviews on the investment have continually shown an evaluation shortfall where we've been able to evaluate and quantify activities that have been undertaken with funding, outputs in terms of infrastructure works, but we've had trouble identifying whether that's led to intermediate outcomes, so better land management and increased ground cover, and long-term outcomes. Are we actually heading towards that alternate hypotheses of sustainable agriculture and healthy aquatic ecosystems? The links between the activities and outputs to the intermediate outcomes have been largely unquantified, as have the long-term outcomes. To look at the moving towards those long outcomes, I've just got to put an imperative that underpins it all, and that is that ground cover is king. My good friend Dr. David Freeban was the first one I heard this claim from, and I've come to realise how important that insight was, where increases in ground cover are important if we want to reduce soil loss. They're also important if we want to retain rainfall or increase infiltration. There's a lot of scientific studies that have been done by Freeman, Silburn and others that have confirmed this. And essentially, if we've got bare ground and it rains, we end up with a lot of dirty water running off. If we've got good ground cover and the same rain can result in less runoff and cleaner water. So more production and less impact on streams. Looking now at how we can look at the management signal in ground cover data. Ground cover can be influenced by climate, landscapes and by management. What I've done in this work is identify a study catchment that's dominated by grazing land management. I've split that up into areas where pasture ground cover can reasonably be compared. I've called these landscape units or climate landscape units. And I've then tried to remove the climate signal by comparing ground cover within the units with the near best ground cover in each of those units. The study catchment selected was the Upper Maranoa catchment in the northern Murray-Darling Basin and southern inland Queensland. This catchment was selected because it has 96% grazing lands. It's a 12,000 square kilometre catchment, 96% grazing land and a significant NRM extension footprint of over 36%. That is, there's a lot of money's been put on the ground with that NRM investment. To identify climate landscape units, we looked first at the climate clusters, so looked at gridded climate data and looked at where that was season by season comparable and looked the same. By cluster analysis, the IBRA subregions as broad landform definitions, and then I further split that on timbered or open grazing based on foliage projected cover data. With all of these, we came up with 27 different climate landscape units within that catchment. Looking then at the management signal in ground cover data, I've adapted the work done by Bastin et al, where they looked at and said that, in a given area, Bastin et al identified that the best ground cover in an area gave you an indication of what's possible in any given climate situation. And what we've done now is we've compared the median ground cover with that best within each of those 27 regions to identify how management is impacting on the median cover. Zooming in on the 2015 from this data set on the top, we look at the blue line there as the best cover, the 95, the best 5% within the given landscape unit. And then I've looked at treated area, which is where NRM investment's taken place, which is the grey line, and then the orange line is the untreated area or a control area where there was no demonstrated NRM investment. What I've then done is pulled the blue line up to the 100 mark, and the delta between the ground cover and the best possible and the median ground cover gives us a ground cover score out of 100. Across the catchment, we looked at the results and we found that the control was not much different to the supported properties. So where investment was put on the ground was not much different. And in fact, there was improvement in both the land care period, so pre-NRM investment and post. The key message though is that there's ongoing improvement in ground cover scores from 1990. And what came through is improvement is not confined to the NRM investment area, and nor is it confined to the NRM investment period. Looking at individual properties, and the blue line here is the property's ground cover scores, the green line is the catchment ground cover scores, and we can see that some properties, this example property shows a significant improvement in ground cover scores during the NRM investment period. However, that wasn't universal, and we have another one here with the blue line is a property that had NRM projects funded, but didn't result in improved ground cover scores on that property. With the questions around some properties being going in the right direction and some not, I then undertook a landholder survey to validate and explain the data. We managed to get 75% of the supported or treated properties participating in the survey, and the findings in short were that remote sensing ground cover data is consistent with observed land conditions. The ground cover scores are mostly consistent with observed condition and management decisions. The NRM impacts extended well beyond the mapped treated areas to include significant parts of mapped control areas. And essentially that was many people had property outside of where they actually had funded activities, or they were part of family enterprises that included property outside of the treated areas. So the extension impact went well beyond the treated areas. And similarly, even within the treated areas, NRM was not the only contributor to improved management. Also from the survey results, we had a look at some of the enhancers to improve management. The NRM extension information and the process were both important. The process included the opportunity for landholders to get together and discuss matters. NRM incentives certainly help people to make changes sooner rather than later in some instances. Active pasture monitoring had a very strong association with the properties where there was improved management during that period. Improved management inhibitors included succession or succession planning, or poorly done, there was negative results, and well done, there was some positive results. Health of individuals within an enterprise, and particularly in rural areas, this health led to an associated decline in management signal on the ground cover. Natural disasters, not surprisingly, have also contributed to degraded land, not as much towards those ground cover scores. Weeds and pests were blamed, including native and introduced animals. And importantly, what came out in a lot was the instability of vegetation management legislation was a significant inhibitor to ongoing improved grazing land management. But out of all of that, looking at whether we've achieved the objective of measuring whether we've got better land management and increased ground cover, coming from the activities and outputs that were funded, yes, there was an improvement, but the funded activities weren't the only contributors to that improvement. So grazing land management is improving. NRM has contributed, but it's not the only contributor. We came there now to try and quantify that and see whether that will contribute to more sustainable landscapes. We'll have to work quickly through this. I'll give you a link to the thesis where the detail is fleshed out at the end of the presentation. But what we did is we looked at identified that management signal and isolated that from the ground cover trends generally. And we then looked at how we might adjust the observed ground cover to simulate ground cover for management that was in place in 1990, that was in place in 2004, and it was in place in 2017. With those adjustments identified, we then adjusted the observed ground cover data, the seasonal ground cover data, according to those adjustments. And we were also able to look at best ground cover data in each area and identify what's possible. Given seasonal conditions, what's the best ground cover possible in each of the regions, so we can look at what we're aspiring to. That was translated into model inputs with corrections applied to rasters for each season for each of the 27 years. Those rasters were then provided to the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy, who used them to calculate cover factors for the soil loss equation and put those into the e-water source model, and it was rerun for each of those scenarios for 1990, 2004, 2017, and the aspirational 2050. The results in terms of total sediment export, and I'd ask you to focus on the blue bars here, which is for the study catchment. The orange bars are for the broader catchment. What you see there is a reduction in total sediment export from the high 90s to the low 90s, going from 1990 to 2017 or 18. But we also see that the best possible is in the 80s. So when we're comparing the sediment exports and the improvements, we're not aiming for zero. We never should be aiming for zero sediment exports. Sediment movement in a land catchment is a natural process. Flipping that around a little bit then, the reduction in catchment sediment export from 1990 to 2004, we saw about a 1% reduction. And then from 2004 to 2017, during the regional NRM investment period, we saw another 2%, so a total of 3%. But the best possible, if we get to the best possible, if all we wanted to do was grow grass, we would only get 12% reduction in sediment loads. So we've achieved about 25% of what's possible. Putting that down in another graphic then, what we've achieved towards what's possible, if we call what's possible the 100%, we've actually achieved 25% of what is possible for reduced soil loss and stream sediment load from hill slope erosion only. So in summary, grazing land management is improving in the study catchment. Regional NRM and land care have contributed to improved management. The adapted dynamic reference cover method provided a management signal trends in observed ground cover, so identifying a management signal. And the source catchment model enable us to quantify the outcomes during both the land care and the NRM investment periods. So we've achieved the intermediate outcomes and we've been able to quantify those and suggest that we're moving towards, we haven't achieved, but we're moving towards more sustainable agriculture with reduced soil loss and reduced stream sediment loads. Thank you. My contacts and further information available if you wish. Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you some work that we've done on quantifying. Thank you. Give me time for them to load. There's one there for Paul McDonald. Matthew Fletcher, yes, there was one example provided in the screen show of where ground cover improved, and there was a long-term improvement in that ground cover. And there was also the example of where it didn't improve despite NRM investment. I did provide individual property maps, which I shared with landholders, but I can't share them publicly at this stage, other than what I have done as example plots in the thesis. Andrew Drysdale. Yeah, I did try and explain. So why was the investment impact extending beyond the treated areas? Part of that was because investment wasn't the only contributor to improved management, and the other part was that the NRM footprint was not the limit of the NRM impact. So many landholders own properties outside of the NRM funded project areas. So the impact of the extension activities was well beyond the area of where incentives were put on the ground. Thank you all.